and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, for spending your time with us on today's event, How to Win Foreign Direct Investments, or FDI, for Indonesia. So this event is hosted by two independent think tanks. The one is Legatum and Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. To give just a brief introduction on who we are, CIPS is an independent think tank that advocates for practical policy reforms informed by evidence-based policy research and analysis. Our policy perspectives are based on the belief that only civil, political, and economic freedom allows Indonesians to achieve greater prosperity. And we also have our dear friends from Legatum Institute joining us all the way from London, United Kingdom. They are an independent London-based think tank with a mission to create pathways from poverty to prosperity by fostering open economies, inclusive societies, and empowered people. The Legatum Institute recently this year published the Global Index of Economic Openness 2019 that ranks countries' ability to interact with and benefit from both domestic and international commerce. So today we will be discussing, and our speaker will be introducing the Global Index with a specific case study on Indonesia. So that will be really interesting for all of us. And then we'll have a policy discussion as well on how to attract FDI, focusing on the policy reforms needed to cultivate better investment climates. This is an opportune time to be talking about this since we all know that Joko Widodo has been really pushing for FDI towards his second presidency. You can get a copy of the Global Index from outside. You can also download it from the website. We have the QR code somewhere in the back, so you can scan it and read it online if you want. Today, we will have three esteemed speakers with us. First, Stephen Brien, Director of Policy at the Legatum Institute. He will be introducing the index and share findings, especially from the Indonesia's case study. He actually just finished meeting with BKPM, with other ministries, so thank you so much for being with us today. And then after that, we will be hearing from Rainer Heufers, the Executive Director of CIPS, Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. Rainer will share his analysis on the reforms needed to attract Indonesian investments to Indonesia, especially related to foreign trade and foreign investments. Last but not least, we will also have a perspective from the practitioners. So we will have Pak Putra Satria Sambijantoro. Pak Satria is currently a chief economist at PT Bahana Sekuritas with years of experience on the field. So he will be sharing his insights into the current investment climate from a practitioner's point of view. The panel will then be followed by question and answer and discussion with the audience. So if you can all please hold your questions until the end, we will definitely have plenty of time for question and answers later. So without further ado, I would like to invite Stephen Brien to the stage to share your findings.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for that warm introduction, and to Rainer and the entire team. We've really benefited over the last few months working with you all to give us feedback and input into this case study, particularly on Indonesia. And we're always very cognizant of the fact that we come from London. We have a London perspective on life, and that always needs to be mixed with a local perspective to help interpret what we're seeing and to help give us the real nuance and context that we need. Now, as mentioned, the Legatum Institute, London-based think tank, we focus on creating pathways from poverty to prosperity around the world. It's been our mission for the last nearly 15 years. And we do this primarily each year with our sort of key mark study of prosperity around the world, our Global Prosperity Index. And it has taken a view, we've already heard about the idea of open economies, inclusive societies, and empowered people, the sense that for a nation to truly develop, it needs to develop on multiple dimensions. It cannot just purely focus on GDP. We need to ensure that there are strong institutions, the rule of law, property rights, political accountability, etc. And also we need to ensure that the population, is getting the right level of education, healthcare, material resources, etc. And it's only when you look at life on the round you get a truly constructive view of how a nation should develop. The other basis behind our work has been an idea that if we can provide benchmarking, if we can provide objective comparisons across multiple dimensions for different nations in the world, we can create a debate, we can create a sense, maybe even a little bit of competition, but a more objective sense of where people are being successful, where they have opportunities to improve. And that really has been the basis of a lot of our work. Get the facts very straight to start with, understand what are global benchmarks like, who is doing well, who needs to improve, where can we point to good examples of best practice for others to learn from. And it's very much in that spirit that we kicked off our work on economic openness this year. Our sense was that over the last few years, the belief in open markets, in free trade, in sharing ideas, was under some stress and competition and threat around the world, whether you look at the election of Donald Trump or the rise of economic nationalism in other places. The sense was that actually we needed a reassertion of what it meant to have an open economy, what were the benefits of it, what were the challenges indeed in ensuring you had one. So what we did is we pulled together the core economic elements of our prosperity index and generated our global index of economic openness. As I said, taking about 150, 160 countries around the world and benchmarking them along various dimensions that we'll talk about. And then to supplement that, what we've been doing during the year and will continue through for the next year or so is looking at in-depth case studies. So taking countries that we think are of particular importance to the world and doing much more of a deep dive along the structure of the index to say what's going on, what can we learn, what opportunities are there for those countries to strengthen. So we've been looking at the US, the UK as sort of two of the sort of most developed economies. I was in Romania last week talking to a similar group to yourselves and to policymakers in Bucharest about the challenge of the Romanian economy. We're in Delhi on Thursday, and we'll be in Ghana later in December. So why did we choose Indonesia? Well, at one level, the fourth largest country in the world, developing at some good pace, and it's something that's been of long-term interest to us because we see Indonesia as one of the small handful of countries that, if you take a, say, 50, 60-year perspective, has shown continued growth and continued development. So there's something unique in this country in the sense of it's been able to, in effect, follow that journey from poverty to prosperity that we spend our time studying. And it's one of the, say, 6 countries that we're paying particular attention to on that long-term timescale. But on the other hand, and this is where there's an interesting tension and why we think it's particularly interesting to explore Indonesia. There are neighbors. There's a place like Thailand or South Korea, or indeed even Singapore, who in that time frame have done even better. There are many others who have done far worse as well. So Indonesia sits on that sort of threshold, as we see it, of sort of it's worked out just enough to continue, and that's impressive to continue. But there are others who have done better, and we'd like to work out what can we do to help Indonesia accelerate and continue its growth. And then there are those who have not quite made it, and in effect, there are lessons to be learned there about what traps Indonesia should not fall into. Obviously, as a member of ASEAN, there are great opportunities, and we would see the development of trade, and indeed, as the topic of today, the reinforcement of FDI is a very important part of it. So while at one level FDI is a very good measure of the quality of an economy, its attractiveness, for us, we measure FDI in the sense of the capabilities that come in. So it's not really the capital per se, but it's actually what are the broader things that FDI brings in, and what environment do you need for companies with new technologies, new capabilities to want to come and base themselves in Indonesia. So the structure of our index and how we think about the world in economic terms has 4 main themes to it. The first is around market access and infrastructure. And that's where we ask the question, what do you need to have in order to be able to produce goods and services, transport them, deliver them both domestically and internationally? So a real sort of base case of the basic infrastructure, both in terms of, say, transport, communications, electricity and power, resources, as well as then the market access. You know, how easy is it to export into foreign markets? Do you have easy procedures for importing so that you can bring raw materials or intermediate goods in? Is that system working smoothly or not? Then we consider the investment environment. What does it take to get access to capital? Are there good banking systems? Are property rights well enforced? Or are there investor protections to mean that people are willing to give capital because they know that they can enforce their property rights, they can enforce contractual rights, etc.? Then we look at enterprise conditions, where we ask, how contestable are markets? So is it possible to either start your own company or come in as a foreign company and compete in markets? Are they closed to insiders or are they genuinely open? What does it take to start a business? How difficult is it? How many registrations do you need? How many days does it take? How much capital does it take? And what are the burdens of running a business? How many different tax payments do you have to make? What are the other regulatory burdens? And also, what is the labor market like? Is it easy to hire workers? Is it easy to have flexibility in terms of contracts, etc.? All those things that either mean the system works for companies and they embrace the formal sector and participate in it, or, as we see too often in many countries, and this is no exception, there's a lot of informal sector activity, which sort of shows the latent entrepreneurship, but also is a sign that the system itself isn't working for many people. The last area we look at is governance, where we look at the quality of the rule of law, the integrity of the government. Is there corruption? Is it transparent? Does the government work effectively? So if you're a company engaging with the government, do you feel as if you're going to get a fair hearing? Will you get fair tendering? Will the government actually deliver services it's promised or not? And also, what's the degree of political accountability? Is this a politically stable environment or not? And again, Indonesia, particularly around the accountability, is doing very well these days. So that's the sort of core structure that we use. Now, when we look at where Indonesia stands, currently ranked 68th, up 6 places over the last 10 years, so good progress. And it's interesting, in our sort of earlier conversations this morning, we were discussing the fact that Indonesia has gone down in the World Economic Forum Competitiveness Index. This is a much broader index. So we will see, we draw on the World Economic Forum work, but also the World Bank Doing Business and many other sources of information. So our view, we're still sort of, positive on Indonesia. We see progress. We think there's a lot more progress that can be made as well. So our main big positive reference here is the investment environment. This has been an area of focus, and that focus has delivered rewards in that over the last 10 years, it's gone up 27 places in the global rankings, a really strong success story. Now 53rd. So if you think about 68th as being the average, 53rd shows that the investment environment as it stands is a strength. Market access and infrastructure, on the other hand, at 85th, is a weak point. Now, it's a challenge, and we'll come on to that in a minute. Enterprise conditions, 61st, has gone down 3. Enterprise conditions have actually got a bit better, but the real issue here, and this is why some of this benchmarking is really valuable, is that your peer group of countries who started around the same have all improved at a faster rate. As a result, Indonesia's ranking has gone down. So that's a little challenge. And then governance has gone up a little bit, up 9 places, 63rd. It's not necessarily the strongest of the pillars, but it has some very strong, good points. And I think, the success of the election, repeated success of elections, clear political accountability, strength of civil society is absolutely recognized in this pillar. So when we have, and you'll see online, all the global rankings, but I just thought it'd be worth picking out a few interesting neighbors who are both, some of whom are performing better, some of whom are performing weaker. So, in this region, Singapore, from the point of view of economic openness, is way ahead of a lot of other countries. Hong Kong is the other top performer in the world. in this space. But then we see, Malaysia and Thailand have got something that it's worth looking at. I think as sort of similar-ish countries, China and India being the two giants, also somewhat stronger. And then looking down below, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, etc. So what we see, and this is why I described Indonesia as sort of being on that threshold. You've got some high growth, and particularly say Singapore or Hong Kong, successful economies above it. And then you are very definitely performing more strongly than some of these later arrivals. So this interesting sort of midpoint, and that's what makes Indonesia so fascinating as an outsider to come and to research and to understand, because you sort of understand here, what is absolutely necessary. And you've got what is absolutely necessary, but yet maybe not quite, the icing on the cake that could make it even better. Now, these rankings themselves don't necessarily tell you a huge amount about where the strengths and weaknesses are, but having done the work, and thanks to Rainer, I think we're in a position to sort of share a thesis about what we think is the strength, but also where we think the binding constraints are to future development. So I think for us, the clear strength is the quality of the investment environment, and we'll come on to that in a minute. Another strength is sort of the entrepreneurial dynamics, particularly on Java. But it's characterized by the extent to which it's bypassing regulation rather than working with the system. So in the high-tech area, it's not necessarily avoiding regulation, but it's a low regulated area, and it's booming. In more heavily regulated areas, we see informal activity being the dominant source. So there's something about not working with the system. Now, the areas we think that are some real opportunities to build on is infrastructure, international trade, and FDI. So our sense is that while a lot of the investment environment is set up well, there are some issues around FDI that we need to tackle. And there's an attitude towards international trade that we also think needs to be worked on. Then how do you move from informal to formal businesses? What do you have to do to make the system work for everybody? And then finally, let's talk about government and the courts, which for us is sort of the bedrock, the underlying structure of the system, which is either going to work for everybody, is going to be fair and equitable, or less so. And when that gets sorted, a lot of other things can flow from it. So let's start with the investment environment and what we think are a series of really, really positive signs. When I look across at a few of our key indicators, the quality of the investment environment, property rights, for example, have been getting better. So also have intellectual property rights. Now, there's probably still room to improve on those, but there has been a huge amount of progress and absolutely needs to be recognized. Likewise, although the graph doesn't show it that dramatically, going from 45th to 25th in venture capital availability is a very good sign. And that comes from a World Economic Forum survey, so it's not necessarily in terms of the number of dollars floating around, but it gives you a sense of business confidence and a sense that there's venture capital available. Banks, of course, have strengthened greatly in the last 10 years as well, and that's another positive. So too is the insolvency recovery rate. Now, this may seem like a rather sort of technical measure in terms of when a company goes bankrupt, it goes into administration, how many cents on the dollar do you get back? But if you see it as a sign and a signal of the overall quality of the system, how reliable is the system, the financial system in terms of contract enforcement or the way in which the system works and the protections you have, it's a very good sign. And that again has gone up and improved. And likewise, as we said, the quality of the banking system. So I'm just giving you a few little highlights of our analysis of the investment environment, but a broadly positive story here. Now, what could be done to improve it? There's probably some more work on property rights, particularly as we see it around some of the expropriation issues. So when the government has an interest in an area, how does it behave? How do we make sure there are very clear and predictable rules about that? Shareholder rights are pretty strong, but when you compare against other countries, one of the notable gaps is the ability of shareholders to sue the management of companies for any sort of breach of contract or expectations. And that's a sort of a notable gap in the current legal structure for shareholders. And then I think the other key thing is you've got a small but growing stock market. How do you boost that? How do you take the fact that you've got one of a very high savings rate, 34% of GDP is a very, very high savings rate, but that level of savings has not yet gone into equity investments, and there's a channel issue there about how to get the stock market developed. Okay, so that's the good news. That's the really strong, what we would say is a strong highlight. Now, let's go through a few of the areas where we think improvements could really make a difference. First up, infrastructure. Now, notwithstanding the traffic jams we've all been through today as we got here, I don't see the infrastructure issue as one of sort of criticism or challenge, but like a real honest reflection of an economy that's growing quickly. That's this is a complex geography that you're working in, and a real challenge to keep the investment levels up, to keep pace with the growth of demand and the expected future growth. So whether we're talking about the 5,000 kilometers of extra roads the president has promised, addressing slow download speeds, whether it be broadband or mobile, the Palapa Ring that was inaugurated, I think it was earlier, Ryan helped me, earlier this week, wasn't it? They will make a difference. But our sense is you're going to need to do more than just that. And it'll be really important not to rest on those laurels. And I think when you think that it was it, again, Ryan, I'm looking to help me, 2003 or 2006 when the memo first came out about the Palapa Ring, when it was more than 2006, okay, 13 years ago. It took 3 years to build and 10 years to sort of plan how to work its way through the system. That's a signal of some of the challenges, because the need for it was identified a long time ago, but yet it's taken a long time to get up and running. I'd say, again, energy is another issue where we're seeing, and you could just anticipate the need for extra generator supply, but I think a question of the structures, who's going to build the power generator, how are you going to manage the distribution? Because at one level, it's all very well putting in the extra generators, but most countries' power systems, their point of failure and the point of weakness is in the distribution system. And I would say looking at a government monopoly that regulates itself, being in charge of some of the most sensitive, economically sensitive activities is one that you might want to also think about. How do you give confidence to investors that if they want to build a factory, that they're going to get an uninterrupted power supply and that they will get that into the future? That's where some of the deregulation we'd advocate could be really helpful. If there was an independent regulator of the power distribution system, you could give people a lot more confidence. So we would say here, increase access to broadband, sort of no-brainer. We know everybody's in favor of that, and there's a lot of effort behind it. Continued investment in transport, again, we know there's political momentum behind that. We'd suggest continuing it. One other thing that becomes a bit clearer about some of the challenges on the electricity front is, if you have high levels of subsidies and price controls, you're creating a market where the economy or the economics of supply doesn't always work. And I think there was a moment a few years ago when the subsidies were going down, but then as prices move, they've gone back up again. I think it's going to take I would encourage the government to be brave and to continue work on that. And as necessary, find alternative ways of keeping people whole so that you overcome the sort of the understandable political resistance to that. Because if it is about, as I was doing some work in Saudi Arabia a few years ago on exactly this issue and saying, look, if the political backlash is around poor sections of the community not being able to afford higher prices, find a way of helping them afford it so that the broader economic benefits of proper price signals can come through. And then the last one, we have been told it's happening, but I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Can we see real PPPs set up, not just the state-owned enterprises, but others getting access to contracts and starting to have much more of a competitive market for infrastructure development? I'd say for all those of you here who are keen to hold the government to account, keep a close eye on that and see what's happening. We've heard warm noises, but will it come through is a matter I leave for you to judge. Right, so the next opportunity is one it's sort of half there already, but I think it's worth recognizing that the attractiveness of Indonesia to FDI isn't always from the outside as rosy as the picture may seem from the inside. So one of the things, if you are going to bring foreign investment in, and that investment is not just going to serve the local Indonesian economy, but say regional trade, you need to make sure that border compliance, border administration is easy and smooth. And now I know that some people in the Customs Authority will say this isn't measuring everything, and there are some disputes about some of these figures. I would again say, if that's what the outside world thinks, the reality and the perception are both important. At the moment, the perception is not great. The World Bank had a story about how long it took and how costly it took to get mandarins from Shanghai to Jakarta versus Jakarta across to the east of the country. And the view was that the internal transit was more costly and took much more time, despite Shanghai being 6 times further away. That says something about the way the system, the infrastructure, the logistics works. And to attract in more investment, you're going to need to work on both reality and the perception. Now, this perception issue then has played into a rather worrying set of reports back from the World Economic Forum. And this is partly one of the reasons why Indonesia's overall score in the Global Competitive Index has gone down. Like it or not, the outside world, and this is a survey of hundreds of experts around the world, is taking a view that, having been a very attractive business environment for FDI, has become less attractive, and that fewer international companies are coming into Indonesia. Now, I think there'll probably be many statistics that may challenge that. But if you're saying what's happening and how are people going to make decisions, they are going to be looking to these surveys, and these surveys do reflect people's attitudes. So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done on seeing how the mindset and the public perception of Indonesia towards international trade, towards foreign investment, towards foreign workers is addressed. Now, the story I heard, and again, you'll all be more familiar with this, is that there has been a lot of debate around the election on some of these issues, and that is predominantly an election-led debate that will then die down, and people will, particularly if there's a coalition-style government, a cabinet formed next week, that people will knuckle down and get sorted out. But the thing you've also got to realize is that the international community will hear about Indonesia and will think about Indonesia during the elections. So the election noise is the signal that gets sent out everywhere else as well. So even if everybody else knuckles down for 4 years and doesn't have these debates, that's going to be in people's minds. So in terms of getting market access sorted out, I think there is work to be done on reducing dwell times at ports. Future trade agreements still need to be worked on. I think the Australian one still needs to be ratified. And there's, of course, the ongoing negotiation with the EU, which is sort of, worth persevering at. And I'll certainly tell you from a London-based audience, we understand how difficult those negotiations can be. But we are looking forward to seeing what happens this week. But likewise, hopefully you can get a deal as well. Non-tariff barriers have also got worse over the last few years. I think Indonesia's fallen about 20 ranks in the ratings for non-tariff barriers. So that's another little sort of behind the border, hard to see barrier to doing trade. And in the days now where people are very focused on tariffs and tariffs are going down, the non-tariff barriers, or we've got some special labeling that you need to put on, or you have to have all your meat tested by an Indonesian meat tester. These little things all add grit to the system and are all worth flushing out if possible. And I'd say, I'd be interested to see what Rainer and others think about this. Looking at it, the negative list for FDI is still quite long. And it's not like the small number of national security sectors that other countries have. There's still quite a high degree of protectionism in that list. And again, could that get chipped away? How would you do that? Question mark. Enterprise conditions. So how easy is it to start a business? What are the barriers? This is where it becomes quite interesting. You look around the city here, and you get the sense of vibrancy. Juan, our videographer, has been all over the place, seeing all sorts of great new ventures and and great startup conditions in many places. But the facts of company registration tell a slightly different story. And I think both of these observations are true. See, this measurement of new business registrations is, of course, capturing the extent of formal businesses being registered, whereas what one and the rest of us all see out on the roads is the informal businesses and the dynamism of people who are, again, working around the system. And then when we look at the ease of starting a business, it's still 113th. And I know there's the new single, the online submission system. But I think, as we were told, if the internet doesn't work well in government offices, your ability to register a company online isn't really going to work. I see some smiles in the audience here. So this is where the second and third order issues are really important. It's all very well creating a very investment-friendly environment. We get investor protections sorted out, we make sure corporate governance works, etc. But if businesses can't form, if you can't get your shipping goods in and out of the port easily, if you struggle to get, and we look at hiring and firing and employment costs, if you struggle to hire people or you worry about the cost of letting them go, all these other associated issues are critical, and particularly for foreign companies who are going to have to play the formal route. We're going to have to, as you would expect, and appropriately so, as it were, obey all the laws, because a foreign investment is very transparent, it's in the public eye, it naturally will be expected to play the formal system completely. And when it's, as it were, competing with or engaging with those in the informal sector, again, it makes life more difficult. So I think the question I would be doing is asking myself, why is it that so many companies stay informal? And what do we have to do to entice them into the system? Not to force them in. And it was another little debate I had when I was advising the Saudi government. They were in a similar position, very much looking at, we've got all these informal businesses, we need to get them to formalize, they need to regularize themselves. And that was for the Ministry of Trade. I was working with the Minister of Economy, and our argument was, well, how do we create the conditions whereby they want to formalize? What do you have to do so that becomes a voluntary act? Because it's better to be in the system, because if you're inside the system, it's easier to get access to capital. You can actually get the government to work with you. All these things that benefit from being inside the system. But at the moment, a lot of people are making a rational and perfectly sensible trade-off to say the costs of being inside the system are too high versus the opportunities outside. How do we change that? So, that's where I think there's a broad increase of contestability of markets. I don't think that sort of the Competition Commission is necessarily doing a bad job here. I don't think that's really where I'd worry most. I'd look at reducing the burden for firms entering the formal sector and staying there. I'd look at increasing the labour market flexibility so that contract employment works more. In a gig economy, we need to move away from this paradigm of one permanent job for life that's full-time with one employer. And I think the other one, and we know the President is a big fan of this, improving workforce skills, so that you're not having to go in the short term to get foreign skills in, start building them here. Now, the last one, I'll be quick on this one, is the rule of law. There have been actually some really good improvements here. So again, let's recognize those. Dispute settlements got more efficient. Judges are regarded as more independent. This is a good thing. This is really, really important. However, when it comes to the quality of administration and the efficiency of settling disputes, the rankings are low. So what's going on here? One of the things that we found that I think is, again, very important to foreign businesses is that the sense of precedence in Indonesian courts is weak, in that in most OECD countries, there's an established way of working within the courts that if a decision is made on one ground 1 week and a similar decision comes to the court the next week, they will use the same rationale so that people can, in effect, anticipate what's going to happen. Our understanding, again, love to hear from the audience in discussion, is that is less the case here. And again, for external eyes, the fact that the court system seems to be unpredictable is a matter of concern. And also the fact that decisions made outside the jurisdiction are not automatically recognized within the jurisdiction is another concern for people who are playing on the international fields. And then when you look at some of the other measures around the integrity of the legal system, which I think is probably more important for an economic audience, the sense that the judges are open to influence, are open to corruption in some places, again, is a worrying sign. There's one statistic that says 6% of all Indonesians have paid a bribe to a judge in the last year. When you think about how frequently people do or should go to court, that's a shockingly high number. How do you deal with it? Is a big question. And it's more about social change. It's more about creating the conditions so that people want to, obey the decisions, people want to respect the decisions, people want to allow the judges to make those decisions because it's better for all that the judges operate in a systematic, fair, and transparent manner. And there's a big argument in the sort of corruption world, the corruption academics, about whether is corruption a fundamental problem or is it a symptom of other issues? And most people are now coming to the view that corruption is a symptom rather than a cause. So you won't solve corruption by having a great big corruption commission fighting it. You need that to keep it under control. But to get to the root issues, you need to think about how is the system, how does society work, how is it viewed as being fair, transparent, worthwhile working within the system rather than against it. And that's where I'd like to end with another one of these rankings that shows Indonesia at 116th in the world for use of public office for private gain. So too many people are perceived, anyway, to be in the government making decisions that serve them personally rather than serving the nation. And that, at the heart, is probably one of the things that the President, I know, has mentioned, and I know that say that really, in the end of the day, for the broad long-term improvement of the economy of Indonesia, some of these issues, some of these deep issues, are actually some of the most important to get right. Because with them right, in many ways, a lot of the more superficial direct impacts are much easier to manage when you've got the system working for you. So I will finish up by just summarizing then the main areas that we think are opportunities to strengthen Indonesia's economy. One is infrastructure investment, desperately needed. But how do you do it in a way that doesn't simply just roll out more contracts to state-owned enterprises and not bringing competition in? I think removing the protectionist policies, so reducing the negative list, making it easier to import and export. Then formalize business activity. How do you make it so that people voluntarily want to join the system, want to register? And then finally, work on improving governance. And we think if you tackle those four areas, you can easily go from 68th to 40, 30. There's a lot here that can be done, and a great opportunity. We look forward to going back in a few years and seeing some of this already in action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that quite a positive outlook for Indonesia, I should say, in terms of our progress and economic openness, and also at the same time a very sobering reflections on the opportunities for improvement, to put it. And one of those opportunities, as you mentioned, is on trade and foreign trade and how open we are to foreign trade. So I would like to next invite Rainer Heufers to give us an analysis of a more in-depth analysis on foreign trade and how that relates to foreign investments.
Very good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see you all here. It has been a great pleasure to work with the Legatum Institute, Stephen, and the other colleagues here. It is an impressive analysis that you have, and I am also additionally always impressed when you see somebody far, far away in London looking at Indonesia in so much detail and comes up with a pretty accurate picture, I would believe, in what's happening here. I'm sure there are a lot of things to be discussed, but as we were requested, we hold our questions until afterwards. So after you've received so much detail, I want to broaden it up a little bit and more talk about general growth and growth path of a nation, and how all that matters in this path. Briefly, I am with the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies. So we are producing policy papers. For example, here 3 This left one would be on the ease of doing business. The middle one is more on food, trade, rice, etc. And on the right-hand side, a recent paper that we produced on the Indonesian fintech sector and what it takes to actually take it forward. So we produced this analysis, and when we were approached to cooperate with the Legatum Institute, we felt it was very much in line with what we do, because the index looks at the general situation. We are trying to give policy recommendations for Indonesia to move forward with its investment conditions at home. So I said, I want to broaden it up a little bit. So we have generally always had a debate on whether foreign trade and foreign investment are actually complements or substitutes. This debate reminds me very much when I was living in China. That was in the 1980s. And the big question was always, the Chinese said to the foreign companies, stop just selling us things. Come and invest here. Bring your expertise, bring your technology, but don't just sell to us. We want you to come and produce here. So the Chinese were very clear already in the 80s, we want FDI, we want foreign direct investment. So it was a bit like there's a substitute, less trade, more FDI. That at least was the position back then that was quite common in China. But as you see, I quote here a rather old report, but I think still it's valid. In host countries, usually foreign direct investment tend to increase imports. Yet, in the longer run, there will then be more exports by the country. So you go through a phase of more imports before you can come to a phase of more exports. But while you go through this import stage at the beginning, you have the benefits of technology transfer, because with the FDI you get the technology, you get job creation, you get local subcontracting, so you get expertise in the country, etc. That's exactly what China did in the 80s already. They said, we want technology, we want you to train our staff so that we have the skills in the country. So that's exactly what it did. And if you look at the results in terms of trade balance, it's textbook. Starting in 1982, it was almost always a balance. And sometimes China was at a trade deficit because there were a lot of imports. And you see how the exports are exploding only later. So if you want to get to that stage where you are a big exporter, you have to have something to offer to the world. And you only get there if you get the technology and the skills and everything into the country first. Also, China didn't develop this by itself. Even by now, of course, you have technology companies that can create new technologies in China. But the first decades was all about getting it into China from abroad. And now look at Indonesia and the European Union. We had a good study done a while ago on the decade of Indonesia-EU economic relations. And you can see that a 1% increase in imports from the EU to here leads to an increase of FDI to Indonesia by 2.5% almost. So there is a correlation that works, there's a causality even. If you import, that means you are getting the technologies that you need to then so you get the imports because the companies that are investing here, they actually need the goods so that they can actually work and operate here. At the same time, if you have an extra $1 billion US dollars FDI from the EU here to Indonesia, the imports will also increase. So you have indeed an increase in imports. It will happen. But then you also see that the exports will also happen, and exports will also affect FDI. So there is a causality between all three, between imports, exports, and FDI. They belong together. You can't just say anymore there is either a substituting or a complementing. It's just all intertwined. So if you want FDI, you have to import. You can't have one without the other. It just doesn't work that way. Now we have the new position that came out later that said, okay, this is not so much an issue about substituting or complementing between FDI and foreign trade. Rather, what it means is how do these companies that want to invest, how do they get their resources? And so here we're talking about factors that make particular locations advantageous for particular activities for both domestic and foreign investors. And that's why this report on economic openness in Indonesia is so important. Because it talks about the factors how domestic and foreign investors can actually grow. So the Global Index of Economic Openness is not just a textbook for how to get FDI into the country. Of course, it applies equally to domestic investors. And I think that's something we should keep in mind very much. But what we do have in Indonesia still so strong is whenever there's a trade deficit, somebody rings the alarm bells. Terrible, we have a trade deficit. And it is very hard to get that out of the minds of so many people. A trade deficit is not a negative thing. A trade deficit is necessary if you want to get technology into the country. It has to happen. It's the current account deficit is a different story, but the trade deficit, not so much the issue. And look at what is imported. What is being imported to Indonesia? Out of the total 100%, 9% is consumer goods. 75% is raw materials. And 15.9%, so more than 90%, is capital goods and intermediary goods. More than 90% are needed for business in Indonesia. It's not consumer goods that the Chinese sell their toys and their fridges and their washing machines. That's consumer goods. That's only 9.1%. The majority of the imports that are coming into this country are used to grow business in Indonesia. It's the best thing that can happen for the country. Of course, if you had a thriving commodity sector, etc., it would be less on raw materials, but nevertheless, almost all of the imports are used for production purposes. And I think that's a good thing to have. Another international example, look at Korea. Korea is very famous for an export-driven nation. The export substitution, etc. So the export-led growth strategy was very much associated with the name Korea. And Korea, as you can see, they had marvelous growth rates early on in the 1960s and 70s. So that's when they really had their, well, in Germany you would call it economic miracle. So that was the time when they really thrived and started their success transition. And what happened at the same time with the trade deficit? They had a huge trade deficit at the same time. You can see how this goes along here. The growth rates until early 80s, very, very high, and until the early 80s, you had a very large trade deficit. That's when South Korea got all its technology into the country, all the raw materials and everything it needed for a successful takeoff into an industrialized nation. So this is what is required, and I'm stressing this so much because in Indonesia there's such a strong paradigm that a trade deficit is by nature bad, and I don't agree with that. And there's a strong skepticism towards foreign trade, and I think that's also stopping Indonesia from developing to its full potential. What drives foreign investment? Of course, we need to find out, so what makes somebody to invest? And we have A.T. Kearney, the consulting company that actually does this confidence index, and they basically this year came up with a report that says FDI seems to be driven increasingly by investors' pursuit of localization. The practice of shifting companies' management, operations, etc. to local markets. So the companies understand, if I want to do business in Indonesia, I have to go to Indonesia. I have to be here, I have to be a local company to make that happen. Companies are aware of that. And so the index of economic openness is so important because that shows how much welcome they are to do that and what obstacles are there. What are they looking for, those people with their FDI? They're looking for availability of quality targets. So are there interesting partners for joint ventures? Are there sectors that are interesting and open to cooperation? The macroeconomic environment, of course, is very important. But I want to alert you also to the middle range where it says regulatory environment, the 22%. That's also very important. And we heard a lot about regulatory environment just now by Stephen, and there are still problems that need to be addressed. So that's what companies are looking for. What you see in total now in the world is that the global FDI inflows are going down tremendously in the world. That has a lot to do with US tax policy. So the Trump administration changed tax policy, a lot of FDI coming back. But it's also the trade war, obviously, that has an effect on this. Companies that suffer from this is mostly countries like Germany, Switzerland. So a lot of FDI are leaving European countries. China is still benefiting. China is still attracting. And you can see in the blue line, the emerging and frontier markets in general are not really hit by that. What about Indonesia? We had remarkable increase in FDI since 2014. I mean, longer, but the graph shows. It was peaking last year, and ever since it has been a little bit erratic. So the numbers it's not just a smooth increase anymore. And that kind of like is an indicator that something has to be done. We also learned that the Global Competitiveness Index, Indonesia has been losing 5 positions. And even in the Global Index of Economic Openness, Indonesia has lost 1 position in the last year. So you can never rest on what you have, even though we have a lot of progress in Indonesia. One main reason why Indonesia is doing so well in attracting FDI is the market size. Indonesia is so huge. I want to be here. It's a great market. And number 2, we have a high economic stability. No wars and no real rebellion, etc. So that's quite good. And this is numbers from the Global Economic Competitiveness Index. And here you see macroeconomic stability, and here you see the sheer market size. So that's great. But Indonesia got downgraded. And so there are problems. So yes, you have the market size. If you were Cambodia or Laos, you wouldn't attract that much FDI. You have 270 million people. That's fantastic. And you have stability. That's also fantastic. And a lot of people really appreciate that. But you can't rest on that. You have to do more to attract more FDI. And as I just said, look at the economic openness, how it developed over time. And then you see the last 2 years. I find that super important because there's an improvement. The score actually went up, but the rank went down. Why? Because other countries are faster than Indonesia. You are in a competition with other countries, and if they improve faster, you fall behind, you fall back. So even if you say, wait, but we have opened up this and we have done that, well, others are even more ambitious. And here, I don't want to repeat what has been already delivered by Stephen just now. You have all the areas in which work still needs to be done. And market access and infrastructure, in investment environment, enterprise conditions, and governance. All these areas that we had. And you just have to read the report to get all the details. In short, I would say, in summary, 3 main issues, similar to the conclusion that Stephen just made. One big issue is market access, regulatory obstacles. I started a company in Singapore, it took me half a day. That company started a rep office in Jakarta, it took me 9 months. In Singapore, I paid almost nothing. And here I spent a lot of money to do that. Even though the World Bank says it's only like that little and so on. No, the reality looks a little different. So regulatory obstacles are huge. SOE dominance in several sectors, cartels, as we know, this all has an effect on market access. Foreign trade is a big issue in terms of protectionism, regulatory environment. We know it's often uncoordinated, several ministries doing several things, and often also it is restrictive. Just at the end, quickly looking at other indicators under other indices. So the ease of doing business index, of course, everybody is very familiar with this. We know there's an improvement over the years, just like in the index for economic openness. So in general, good trend. But what are the problem areas? Starting a business, registering property, trading across borders, and enforcing contracts. So foreign trade and regulatory environment. These are the two core areas that and market access that still have lots of problems. Another index, there are many by now, and they all also feed each other to a certain extent, is an Economic Freedom of the World report that just came out on September 12th. In general, Indonesia has improved a lot, like in every other index. But what is not yet improving well enough is the legal system and property rights, freedom to trade internationally, and in particular, regulations, the regulatory environment. And here, in particular, the labor market regulation. So this repeats what you just heard from Stephen. It's again and again the same message that is a problem. Just the labor market. We saw in Stephen's presentation just now, the redundancy cost, if you want to let go of a person who works for you, can be 60 monthly wages. It can be enormous. And why was that? In the old days, there was no social security system. So somebody leaves the company after 20, 30 years, the only money that person can have is the redundancy, the severance payment. That was a sort of a social security system. But by now, there is increasingly a social security system in the country. So it's time to adjust the labor market when the social security system is taking this over. It doesn't make sense to have both at the same time. My last two slides, this already seen similar from Stephen. You see how we are competing with other countries. Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand is still ahead. Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, these are all countries that want to overtake. Vietnam is very aggressive. Myanmar is working very hard in reforming every sector of the economy, of the political system, etc., to overtake. But the more important to me is that we compare Indonesia not so much to the ASEAN countries, but to China and India. And now look at what's happening in these countries. China has improved its rank in the global index of economic openness in the last year only, from position 57 to 51. And India from 66 to 57. So you're not just comparing yourself to small countries like Laos or so. Of course, you also have to compare Indonesia to the big countries with similar, lots of provinces, a lot of people, etc. And these countries are moving fast ahead and leaving Indonesia behind. And that would be a bad scenario for the coming generations. With this, I'll conclude. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rainer, for that insightful analysis of foreign trade, foreign investments, and also some of the, what we see as an obstacle here in Indonesia, as you mentioned, the market access, regulatory obstacles, and also restrictive regulatory environment. So from that analysis, maybe we can hear from the practitioner's point of view. Pak Putra Satria Sambijantoro, he is the chief economist at PT Bahana Sekuritas. So he has a practitioner point of view about maybe from the field what kind of regulatory obstacles that you find. So for Pak Satria, you may have the floor.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It was a very good presentation. I hear from very different point of view, very unique. I have informed my associate actually, hey, some of these graphs are actually very interesting, and then we can put out when we present to our clients, especially in terms of the Economic Competitiveness Index. I actually have some 48 slides, but I try to keep it briefly just 10 minutes I have, so it's not going to be as long as compared to the previous speakers. So like I will only explain like roughly like 4 slides about like what's happening in terms of the investment climate in Indonesia. The first slide that I would like to show here is Indonesia is actually attracting a lot of FDIs, like really a lot. Because as you can see in the right graph, our FDI inflows actually took off during the second tenure of President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's administration. I remember at that time the BKPM was headed by the former JP Morgan CEO officer Pak Gita Wirjawan, and actually the FDI inflows were like very, very strong, and it actually boosted the share of investments to our GDP to even among the highest in Asia. We used to rely mostly on the household consumption, but nowadays investments, as you can see, it now accounts for 33% of our GDP. This is actually very, very similar economic models used by China. If you remember China in the 90s, they used to rely a lot to household consumption. And then over the years, they try to invest and they try to import a lot. And then they boost their investment share to GDP to almost 50%. So I think this is like the most underappreciated fact that investments in Indonesia has been more important than ever. As you are seeing right now, from 2016 to 2019, we are basically seeing a stock of FDI inflows. And you see that President Jokowi has built a lot of infrastructure. I personally have been hearing concerns from the markets, from the financial markets point of view, from the short-term portfolio investors. Hey, Satria, President Jokowi has been spending a lot, like to build infrastructure projects, but why it's not reflected in the growth numbers? It's not reflected in the FDI and like so forth. My answer is this: if you build infrastructure projects, it's a long-term investments. So it's not like you build infrastructure projects now and then the result will come out like 5 years from now. It means that if you build, for example, a new seaport in Sorong in eastern Indonesia, you need to wait until the highway is like completed. And after the highway is like completed, you need to build for the power plants to fully operate. And then you need to wait until all of the industrial areas, all of the residential areas are like growing. So it's a long-term bet, and we should not look at it from the short-term point of view. The second point that I would like to note here is, yes, as the previous speaker has already stated, that actually FDI inflows globally are on the downward trend. It's like very clear here that the FDI inflows globally as a result of the 2016 Trump policy is on the downward trend. Impressively, Indonesia's FDI, while negative in numbers, are growing up. And more interestingly, in the first quarter, I attended the briefing with the BKPM chairman, Pak Tom Lembong. He actually expected the FDI inflows, the FDI year-on-year growth to reach double digit again next year. So like this is like a very interesting, because I like my financial markets forecast has frequently been based a lot from the government official psychology. You know, I know about Pak Tom Lembong because he used to work in the market. He's a market player. He worked in the private equity firm in Singapore, and that was not my first time attending Pak Tom's briefing, and Pak Tom Lembong has usually been bearish. Well, Pak Tom is a very, very like a pragmatist official, so he used to like even though he's in the government, he likes to criticize the government a lot. Like, we need like a bolder, like stronger reforms, tax incentives here and there. And he is rarely been bullish. But the last time I attended his like briefing, he's like very bullish. So my guess would be like Pak Tom when foreign investors want to invest in Indonesia, the first person that he would meet is like Pak Tom Lembong. So I guess he must have met a lot of investors waiting to come in that we are yet to know. So he has some data about FDI we are yet to discover. Yes, and I also like this is my most favorite chart. As you have already known that Pak Jokowi around 2 weeks ago, he scolded some of his ministers in the government because in his argument, Indonesia is not attracting enough FDIs. Based on his data, the World Bank data shows that out of 33 companies relocating their plants away from China, 0 came to Indonesia, right? Like around 15 of them decided to relocate to Vietnam. My answer will be this. I think like to some extent we are seeing from different point of view, because Indonesia actually here, this is the annual manufacturing productivity per labor. So like every labor is measured by his like productivity, and every year Indonesia's labor produces like $12,000 in terms of output in the manufacturing sector. Look at Vietnam. We are actually 3 times more productive than Vietnam, and not that far compared to the Philippines and Thailand. Yet, why the companies there decided to invest in Vietnam? And like as you can see, in terms of the average monthly wage, Indonesia is actually the cheapest. So we are the cheapest, and compared to the Vietnam, we are 3 times more productive. I think the most important thing to note here is comparing Indonesia to Vietnam is a mistake, because most of the investments, the fresh FDIs right now are coming from China, right? And China actually has a very similar political system compared to Vietnam. It's a socialist, one-party communist country. So imagine yourself being in the foot of a Chinese investor and you decide to relocate your investments away from China. Which country would you choose? I think the most rational option would be Vietnam, because, well, Indonesia has a democracy. It tends to be like, it could be quite difficult to realize investments. It's even more difficult just like to procure the lands. So I think it makes sense if investors in China decide to relocate their factories away to Vietnam, but not Indonesia. Okay, the last thing that I would like to highlight, here. I tried to break down the exports. Well, like President Jokowi's economic platform based on 2 things, investments and exports, right? I tried to break down the export components of Indonesia. This is the manufacturing exports. These are the commodity exports. So the statistics agency just released a data today that our exports were down 5% year on year. We recorded a trade deficit of almost 200 million last month. But you need to see this from a broader point of view, because indeed we export a lot of like commodities. These are like coal, palm oil, rubber. It went down around 15% year on year. But look at our manufacturing exports. It's actually quite resilient. It's like iron and steel, and then electrical appliances, cell phones, industrial machineries. And this thing is even more impressive if you take into account that most economies in Asia, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, they recorded a double-digit drop here. But Indonesia is like relatively like resilient. Yes, I agree that the high imports are not necessarily bad, but from the financial markets like point of view, if you record 1 billion, 2 billion trade deficit, the portfolio investors will rush to take out their money, because it could trigger the concern from the currency point of view. So yeah, in terms of this is actually like a very interesting, because our imports have been increasing steadily to hit like on average 16 billion a month like throughout last year. Okay. Yes, this is the correlation between. So I break down from the capital good imports. I divided into two again. This is like the machinery and the mechanical appliances imports, and these are the electrical machineries, the blue line. So actually the imports of the productive goods correlate positively to investment growth, as you can see here. So I fully agree with your previous analysis. Okay, the last point that I would like to point out here is the government has floated two ideas basically to boost the investment climate. The first is to implement labor law reforms. The second is to cut the taxes of the corporates. So my own personal view will be reforming labor is very, very good. Is a very good policy, as you have already heard that our redundancy costs are among the highest in Asia, and our labor market is not that flexible for the companies to really invest in FDIs. Well, however, I might not be on the same page in terms of the corporate tax cut plans, because here. So now the corporate tax of Indonesia is around 25%, and President Jokowi has already floated the idea of putting 25% to here, like 20%. So it's equal to like Singapore. Interestingly, from almost 1 hour presentation from the two other like speakers, how many times you heard them mentioning about tax? It's zero. Because tax has never been the issue about governance of like attracting FDIs to Indonesia. Tax has never been the issue. I know this because like before I work in Bahana, I used to work for the US multinational companies, and I used to like present to them, hey, like there's a new tax holiday policy coming up. Hey, there's a new tax like perfection coming up, but they're not interested because the issue is no longer about tax. And if you actually notice here, it's not apple to apple compare 25% in Indonesia and 20% in like Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia. Why? Because the market size of Indonesia alone is bigger than the almost three like countries combined. So if you invest in Indonesia, and then you make money, and then you pay 25% of the taxes. The profits, the bottom line profits that you eventually earn might still be like higher compared to if you invest in Cambodia, but you pay 20% like of the taxes. So I think I stop there, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you for your time.